Hi there. Well, just going through the old complete book of aviation that Dave Panton gave me a few years ago. Welcome to the Superpilotish channel. My name's Graham Wilson, and today, well, it's not super happy, but hopefully I'll try to keep it a little bit positive, anyways. I'll be talking about Dave Panton in my basement. Who is this guy, you say? Well, yeah, you get to a certain age, and then people start leaving you. And Dave was I knew him for about 10 years. And hey, Dan. Yeah, so uh yeah, Dave passed away about 10 days ago. And I just heard about it last or just a few days ago. And that was a bit of a shock. It's like sort of yes, sort of no. He made it to 87, pretty decent age. And I was just talking to the guy. That's another thing. You get older. It's like I was just talking to that guy the other day, and I was thinking, when was I talking to him? It was I talked to him last. Sat next to him at a safety seminar in January. So had a good chat with him actually, and I'm kind of glad I did now. So I first met Dave about 10 years ago. And I first started at the Windsor Flying Club here in Windsor, and Dave would come in, and uh, he would always sit down. And he always had his coffee and his, I don't know if he had a coffee or tea, I forget, but it was, he had a Tim Hortons cup and a muffin, and he'd sit down, and then he would just kind of, he had a walker at the time too. So he was a little slower and just kind of put his walker there, sit in the chair, open up his muffin, get his coffee or tea, I forget what it was, and just see what magazines are around. And it was just like this guy did it all the time. So I'm just thinking, who is this guy? you know, uh, I asked one of the instructors that was there working with me. I was like, "Who's that?" He's like, "Ah, it's Dave. He comes here and has his muffin." Oh well, and he'd look at the airplanes coming and going, and he'd just kind of finish up and leave. So over the years, I ended up, chatting with him quite a bit because, yeah, it was just like, hey, he comes in every day, you're going to say hello. And so I got a few little notes here so I don't forget. It's funny. You started thinking about someone and you remember that story and that story and that story and that story. So yeah, so one of the things about Dave is that he was the consummate tinkerer. He would just be always tinkering and tinkering and making this and making that because he was a retired mechanical engineer. And I remember looking at his walker one time, and it was like that doesn't look like most walkers that you see. And so I commented to him, I don't know, once. It was like, "Hey, what's those are yeah, it's kind of a different walker you have." He's like, "Oh yeah, he custom built it himself," because it was like the walkers that they would sell at the store were big, clunky, heavy things, and it had like a little you could fold into a seat that you could sit on, and it was a little too heavy for him. Just he'd have to put it in his trunk, and that was a pain in the butt because he couldn't walk that well. And so he just said, "Yeah, I'm gonna make myself one." So he got this like lightweight aluminum, and then he was telling me how he made it. It's like first I put castering wheels on it, and then that was a little too wobbly, so I was looking at some other things. He ended up putting rollerblade wheels on his walker, and he said there's a lot less rolling resistance, and like so this tells you what kind of guy he was. And yeah, so he also years ago he built an airplane, and it was that's what I was showing here. That's exactly what his airplane looked like. No, it looked a lot better than that. But it was this kind of a rare airplane that it was called a Pasmani, and it was designed by some guy named Pasmani, and so and I knew he had built it, but I mean his health went down a little bit, and he couldn't fly anymore. So he ended up selling the airplane. It's still flying today, actually. Might need a paint job. Dave always looked at it and said, "I could really use a paint job," but yeah, it's still flying around. And he built this whole airplane from scratch. Like a lot of times, if you're doing a home built airplane now, you'll buy kits. It'll be kind of pre-formed, pre-drilled, and you just pop in some rivets and away you go. But Dave, he built his little Pasmani that looks like that, and he specifically chose that design. And like he just ordered the plans. It was like he said that it was like just a big box filled with blueprints. Like, here's your airplane, go for it. So he had to like order all the material himself and everything. He made absolutely everything. And the coolest thing about it was that he liked the design because these little guys out on the end here, those are fuel tanks, and he like shaped the fuel tanks himself out of aluminum. They're all like aerodynamic and everything, so he had to shape it on a wheel and fit it and everything, seal it all up. And as far as I know, they're still not leaking. Good job. And so he was thinking that he really liked the idea of having the fuel tanks on the wings so that if you crash, the fuel always goes forward in a crash. And that way, a lot of home built airplanes have the fuel tank behind, and you don't want that fuel going onto the pilot. So he just thought it was like a nice, safe design. Fuel goes out that way. The old guy was always thinking. And yeah, it was just amazing. He built that from scratch and started it in his garage, and ended up at the airport. And then it's still flying today. And this is like back, I don't know, late 70s, I guess he probably built that before I knew him. And yeah, so like I said, he was a mechanical engineer. And so he was like just amazing at drawing. I actually collaborated with him on a couple little projects. So because, I used to be well, I guess you could still consider I am a machinist. I got the papers. But when he found out that I was used to work as a machinist, he was like, oh, can you give me some tips? Because he bought himself a lathe, a little lathe, little mill, little hobbyist kind of lathe and mill. And he was always making all these little parts, and he was having little troubles with this and that. And I'm like, oh, yeah, well, your table's probably just not rigid enough, so you can always clamp that down. You got some C clamps. Oh yeah, I'll try that. Oh, that worked great. And then I and then the little, the if I turn this, like the backlash doesn't quite, work for this and that. And it's like, well, just put yourself a dial indicator in there, and then for sure it's right. Oh yeah, that's right. So it was kind of neat. He was always asking me about little tips and stuff. So over the 10 years that I got to know him, he actually turned himself into quite a good accomplished machinist too. I mean, not surprising, the guy was so smart. And so what did we collaborate on? Yeah, so this is another thing. If you ever worked with Dave, he always gave credit where credit was due. So we had the problem with our tow bars were breaking due to metal fatigue. So I said, "Hey, Dave, what do you think? What if we hinge this and did this, and could make it so that it doesn't break, and then we get it welded and it breaks again?" He's like, "Oh, okay, leave it on me." And so he was like, "Okay, so you're thinking something like this." And because he was he was like old school engineer using drafting boards and stuff, he didn't know how to do CAD. And so he's like, "Oh, you want to see something like you want it to look like this, then, right? With the clevis like this." And he would do this like absolutely like gorgeous, almost to scale isometric drawing. Like, how do you do that? I guess if you do it long enough, you get pretty good at it. But yeah, so kind of worked on the tow bars that are still working today and haven't broken. And another time was I was kind of telling him what I needed for. We had a GPS unit that would go into the airplane, and it had like a standalone feature where you could just put it on a desk, and then you could play around with it and get to know the features when the airplane's not running. And so, but it was kind of a pain in the butt to like pick it up all the time and set it up and then put it away back in the CFI's office. And then so it's like, "Hey Dave, could we make it a stand and like we bolt it to a table with a lock and like no one can steal it and stuff?" Okay, great. So I went back and forth between his shop and work a few times, and it was like, okay. He's like, "Do you want this? Do you need this?" And it like everything just fit perfectly and beautifully. It was like the guy really had a attention to detail. And yeah, so that was kind of cool working with Dave a little bit on that stuff. And he would also just like make stuff just because like he thought about it in his head. It was just like he came in one day. He always had this little carrying bag on the front of his walker, and then he would customize his walker and put like a cup holder and all this other stuff so he could carry his coffee and his muffin. And if he had something else, he would attach this bag to it. And So yeah, and he says, "You got to see this." And he pulls this big thing out of the bag, and I'm like, "What's that?" And he's like, "It's a solar powered steam engine." I think it was a steam engine. And anyways, it was just this thing. He's like, "Oh, would you believe you can get like yeah, Wrenchy was." And he was like, "Can you believe that like they're selling solar panels on eBay for like you can get them for like $5?" And it's like, wow, that's amazing. Or and he was always into like he liked wind turbines and solar energy and the idea of getting that stuff going. Um, and then so he's like, and like I'm looking at this, he machined this little looks like a little engine with a piston on it and stuff to make a wheel go around. And I was like, why would you do that? Like, it serves no function other than because he could. He's like, okay, let's go outside. I'll show you how it works. You won't see it in here with the light. So we go, we go outside with this thing. He puts it out in the sun, and the sun hits the solar panel, and this thing just starts going. I was like, well, that's pretty cool, Dave, but I don't know what you'd use it for. But he just wanted to. Oh, I got this idea. I'll try it. So he also had this idea. He was involved with the I wrote it down here, the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. So yeah, there's an observatory not too far out of town here. They got a big like a big telescope out there that was donated. And yeah, so there's a bunch of people that are into astronomy out there, and he thought for fun one day, and it's actually in a newspaper article they did something about it. But I remember him talking to me about this stuff, like, oh yeah, I did this, and I'm trying to get like okay, the size of the Earth versus Jupiter, and then the Sun, and then he was trying to have it so at night you could flick on these lights and you could see like all the planets in the solar system, but at the right size that they would be in. And so he was doing all the math on he's doing all the math to figure out, okay, if that's 10 bazillion miles away, and then it's like this declination and so it would be on the horizon like this. And he figured that all out, and he put it all up, and it's a big hit out at the observatory. And another thing there I was thinking about there, where I guess I kind of helped him out a little bit. I mean, he always did all the work, but at the Canadian Aviation Museum here in Windsor, they've been restoring a Lancaster bomber for years. And Dave would, the guy that was in charge of it, he'd be like, "Hey, Dave, whip me up this landing gear part," or like we got this rusty old thingamajiggy. I don't even know what it's for. This is not going to be airworthy. Can you fix it up there, Dave? So he got all these weird parts and stuff, and he would like look online and try to figure out what is this thing, and it's like, oh, that's a pulley for a cable for the gear door to do, like the landing gear on a Mosquito bomber that's a World War II bomber. Like if you ever look at it, it's this weird, complicated thing with all these little hinges and flappies and doors and all this stuff, just like typical English engineering. And it's just like you look at it and go, what? Somehow it works. So yeah, and then like, oh well, this doesn't fit here because this is a British Whitworth thread, but then I could do that, but it would be the tensile strength wouldn't be exactly right. So if I did it in UNC or UNF, yeah. And then you ask me how to do a British Whitworth angle. How's my tool bit here, Graham? Is that good? Like, yeah, that should work, Dave. But yeah, so he made all these landing gear parts, and one of the times I went over to his garage or his shop, and he had like binders of all these like all the parts that he made for the Lancaster bomber from scratch. He took pictures, documented drawings, like all of his notes, clamp this here, use this size drill, exactly how to make these things, just in case somebody else wanted to restore a plane. And well, this is how you make this bracket, the specific weird little bracket here using, and you'd like take pictures of his lathe and mill. Like he had binders and binders of this stuff all documented. So I hope that doesn't disappear. And another thing there too, Dave gave me over the years. I think I did this in one of my other shows. He didn't give me a 6-pack of beer, but he had this old GPS. for his airplane for vintage 1988 or something like that. I only ever used it once, and I just opened this up, and yeah, so he even gave me fresh batteries, but I mean, these are pretty old, and I can see them. I see, you keep batteries long enough, they start getting all corroded and stuff. But, anyways, he gave me fresh batteries with it, and this is what have we got here? Yeah, so this is like a little pill bottle, I guess. And so when I went into his shop, he had all these little pill bottles. I mean, he was on a lot of medication because he had some health problems there, and he just kept them all, and he organized all of his nuts and bolts and screws and everything in like the proper sized pill bottles. He just had shelves and shelves of these things. And it's like, oh, do you need a quarter 20 lock washer? Yeah, here, boom. There you go. Like, oh, you need an extra fine 3-inch bolt? Yeah, I got one here. He was super organized that way. And so I have no idea. I would have no problem flying his plane that he built. I know it would be done right. So, anyways, yeah. And then so Dave, it was, yeah, his health was kind of going down over the years, but I mean, he was still totally with it. When I was talking to him back in January last, and I asked him if he was still making parts, but apparently he couldn't stand very well, but he could do in his machine shop. He could sit on a stool and do all of his work and do work on a bench and stuff. But he said he couldn't quite do that anymore. So he said he could pretty much only sit around in a chair. But he said, but I got this great drafting board. It's like I can draft like this, and it has like a slide on it, and a built-in slide rule, or I forget what he said, but it was just like it's got this and this, and I could just. So he'd be sitting there in his living room in his chair and just still making mechanical drawings and stuff for this restoring this Lancaster bomber. Okay, guys, this is what you got to do. It has to be this. Yeah, and he did that right till the end, as far as I know. And so it's like, what else can I tell you about him? Oh, another thing too about Dave was that his car was impeccable, and I was so amazed at this guy's car because it was an Oldsmobile Alero, like one of the biggest lemons around, right? They always had problems with electrical for the taillights and everything. But not Dave's. He was like, no, okay, this is what you do. If you're going to get a car to maximize the length of it, I've had this one for whatever, 16 years. Okay, this is like he had this all figured out in his head, how to make the life of a car last longest for the least amount of money. And like his engineer brain was working out the old spreadsheet in his head. And he's like, okay, so you don't oil spray your car until it's 5 years old. Okay, and so you buy it when it's 2 or 3 years old. You got your depreciation off of it. Then you oil spray it at about 5, and then just go in because you don't. It's a waste of time to do that with a brand new car. And the thing is, he did sell his car a little while ago because he couldn't drive, and but he said, "Oh yeah, it was still perfect." It's like, oh, yeah, I'm not surprised, Dave. So, yeah, he did that. So, and he's also big. Yeah, I mean, he flew for years and years. He wasn't like just a builder; he was quite the active pilot too. And yeah, like one of the times I took him up, the only time I actually flew with him, I was going to Pelee Island, which is this little island in the middle of Lake Erie, and so I was going to be going there, and I just asked Dave, "Hey, you want to come along?" And he said, "Oh, not today, but next time you go." So, anyways, because he couldn't bring his walker in the airplane, he had his specially designed lightweight collapsible canes that he had. I think they were collapsible, but anyways, he could walk with these 2 canes if it was only this far, just enough to get into the airplane. And we flew over to the island, and he didn't want to fly; he just wanted to enjoy the view. And it was kind of a neat thing that the water was just wavy enough that day, and just clear enough. It was strange because usually Lake Erie is kind of muddy brown, something like that, or there's big waves and you can't see anything. But we could see right down to the very bottom of the lake, and I was looking. It's like, is that the bottom of the lake? And Dave was like, he was like, real okay. Now he's Dave's on a mission. He's like, is that the bottom of the lake? And he's like staring and staring out the window, and uh, he was and he was like, I've never seen that before. You can actually see the relative motion between the waves and the bottom. That's definitely it, because there's a ridge and there's he was like, that's it, we can see the bottom. And it's like, I've never seen that before. That blew his mind. He talked about it for years after, actually. And he as far as like words of wisdom from the old guy, it was kind of like he always appreciated like every time he was in the air. And he said that a lot of people complain about how you go flying around locally, you see the same stuff all the time. And he said that like I always noticed something different. I enjoyed every flight I did. And so that kind of tells you what kind of a guy he was. And so one time he flew his Pasmani all over the place. He took a bunch of trips here and there, and I guess he got caught in some weather. And I forget where. It seems to me it was like Peterborough, somewhere north of Toronto. He ran into some weather, and it just wasn't working for him, and he had to land. And it was a Sunday, and he had to get back to work on Monday. So he ended up parking his plane up there, and then took the bus home. And he told me, he's like, "Yep. Yeah, that's when I became a real pilot. You're not a real pilot till you come home on the bus." So, that's something I would tell my students too, that it's just like, if you have to cancel your flight and take the bus home, you're a real pilot now. You made the right decision and you're safe. So that was cool. And that's about it for Dave. Okay. And I'll give Dave a cheers here, wherever he is. It's not really wherever he is. It's like, which octa in the sky is he? So okay. Yeah, that's about it. What do we got here? Not a lot of questions. Okay. All right. Some good little statements there from your wrench. And Dan, thanks for showing up, guys. Okay, today is Friday, so I'll be back on Monday. Oh, that's right. And the free cardboard giveaway is still in force, so you still have time to get your mail your request letter. Hey, Graham, send me some cardboard, and I'll put the my post office box in the description below here. Feel free to mail me, and I will mail you a piece of cardboard with fantastic artwork on it. And there we go. So today's Friday, and so that means I'll be back on Monday, because I do this Monday, Wednesday, Friday at noon Eastern. And you guys have a great weekend. And thanks for watching. Bye.